a.m.
To know Jerry was to know a Norman Rockwell painting come to life.
A day for this nation to remember and mourn the 38th President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford, in the city where he served and the one he called home.
This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, reporting tonight from Washington.
Good evening. It was a wonderful life, and that was evident today as the entire power structure in this city and in this government paused to remember and to celebrate the 38th President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford. Tonight, it's not the powerful, but the ordinary people who are saluting Jerry Ford. The president is back home now in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with the people he knew, the people he represented and reflected. After a period of public mourning and repose, he will be buried there tomorrow. First here tonight, our emotional day here in the nation's capital. NBC's David Gregory is with us from the White House tonight and starts us off. David, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. This was an elaborate farewell for the president, who was a modest man, hailed today for his character and leadership during crisis. On a crisp, windswept Washington morning, the casket carrying the 38th president, the common man from Michigan, was escorted from the Capitol. The emotion evident on the faces of Gerald Ford's children and his widow Betty. The cortege moved swiftly through the still of the city, slowing poignantly outside the White House. Gathered at the National Cathedral, Washington's elite, former presidents, first ladies, journalists, and Ford friends who served at the highest levels of government. President Bush escorted Mrs. Ford, the strain of the day plain to see.
To know Jerry was to know a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. An avuncular figure, quick to smile, frequently with his pipe in his mouth.
And so when President Nixon needed to replace a vice president who had resigned in scandal, he naturally turned to a man whose name was a synonym for integrity, Gerald R. Ford. And 8 months later, when he was elevated to the presidency, it was because America needed him, not because he needed the office.
Ford's controversial pardon of Richard Nixon was hailed today as a measure of his character.
Gerald Ford, you showed mercy when others demanded vengeance.
Gerald Ford brought to the political arena no demons, no hidden agenda, no hit list or acts of vengeance.
At one point, while the choir sang, Mrs. Ford could be seen saying to daughter Susan, "It was beautiful." By noon, a final escort through Washington. At Andrews Air Force Base, Ford's casket was loaded on the presidential aircraft. Arriving in Grand Rapids, Michigan, President Ford was home. A president, a family man, and a football player heard the Michigan fight song one last time. The procession ended at the Ford Presidential Museum. For his family, the last solemn steps to this president's final resting place on a day of farewell. There will be an overnight viewing of President Ford's body in Michigan and then the burial there tomorrow afternoon. Brian.
David Gregory at the White House for us tonight. Thank you for that, David. The death of President Jerry Ford affected a lot of Americans in ways they didn't anticipate. It reminded us perhaps of a different era, perhaps a greater generation, even a profile in courage. Whatever it was, many citizens have come out to bear witness, and NBC's Bob Faw spoke with some of them.
In a vaulted shrine, as dignitaries, powerful then and now, gathered. So, on streets outside, did everyday Americans, respecting, indeed identifying with this accidental president, who, as a student, washed dishes, and waited tables. An uncommon commoner.
Your greatness comes through the opportunities or the challenges that you're given.
As Mr. Ford's children consoled one another, he was remembered with silent tributes in his retirement home, Palm Desert, California. As his hometown, Grand Rapids, Michigan, awaited his body, there were unvarnished, heartfelt expressions of thanks. Madeline Climo drove here early this morning from Chicago to say something she'd wanted to say years ago.
I've always admired Gerald Ford for pardoning President Nixon because I just wanted him gone. I certainly never had a chance to thank him for doing that.
The unofficial goodbyes were as straightforward as the 38th president. For him, for them, nothing fancy, nothing glib. He was eulogized today as a leader, not a performer playing to a gallery, an old-fashioned concept still treasured by young and old.
And he's able to come up and step up to the challenge and make a difference for the country.
So this day, the powerful and powerless paid respect, not just to the office of the presidency, but to the modesty and decency of one man.
Former President Ford actually was a ray of hope for us in the 1970s.
Honored on Main Street this day for replacing disgrace with dignity. Bob Faw, NBC News, Washington.
There were 4 eulogies in all at today's funeral service here in Washington. 2 presidents, current and former, a former Secretary of State, and a longtime network anchorman and author. Tom Brokaw is already back in our New York studios tonight and is with us from there. And Tom, first off, can we talk about one of the all but silent participants today, the heroic and stoic Betty Ford?
She's such an important part of the legacy of Gerald Ford's presidency, obviously, and behind the scenes, she's frail now. She's 88 years old, but very strong. Steve Ford told me the other day he was riding with his mother through the streets of Palm Springs for the first time that they were seeing the crowds. He began to tear up, and she leaned over and grabbed him and said, "Buck up, Steve. We've got a lot to get through here." I think that characterizes her. She really set the pace for modern first ladies. She was the first one to speak out about women's health issues like cancer, and she talked about the teenage dating habits of her daughter. She was followed, of course, by Rosalind Carter and Nancy Reagan and Barbara Bush, Hillary Clinton and Laura Bush, all now very much in that model. And she is surrounded as well by those children that we all knew as children, and now they're these wonderfully mature and compassionate young men and women.
And Tom, because you were part of it, what should we know about this gathering today as a gathering of people who knew and loved Jerry Ford?
Well, there were 2 things that struck me. First of all, being in the bubble with those people that I covered at that time. You know, we know about the stars in the administration, but he had such a great staff in the middle ranks. They knew how Washington worked. They came off the Hill or they came out of the agencies, and they were there to join him in healing the country. They were Democrats and Republicans alike, and they were summoned to Washington out of a spirit of public service. And then the extension of that, Brian, for me at least, was as I rode in the motorcade through the streets of Washington and looked at all those people of every color and stripe and standing in America with their hands over their heart or saluting him. Not one of them had a sign that said, "I'm a Republican" or "I'm a Democrat." I think it's instructive that we're at our best and we come together on these occasions, and Gerald Ford was a man who was constantly striving to bring us together.
Yours was one of 4 wonderful eulogies today, Tom. Thanks for being with us tonight. And we'll have more on today's remembrances a bit later on in the broadcast. But first, to the other news of this day, which takes us across the Potomac River here to the Pentagon. NBC News Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski has learned that according to U.S. officials, President Bush is prepared to announce what is being called a strategy of surge and accelerate in Iraq, which would involve, bottom line, some 20,000 additional American troops being sent to Iraq. Jim is with us from the Pentagon with more on this tonight. Jim, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Administration officials told us late today that President Bush has now all but decided to surge those additional combat troops into Baghdad to try to get control over the violence there. And only then could they accelerate the turnover of territory to Iraqi security forces. Fact is, they're just not up to the task yet. The plan would also throw more U.S. money at Iraq for reconstruction and a jobs program. Now, interestingly enough, one administration official admitted to us today that that this surge option is more of a political decision than a military one, because the American people have simply run out of patience, and President Bush is running out of time to achieve some kind of success in Iraq. And while this plan will clearly draw some stiff opposition up on Capitol Hill, the president's expected to announce it a week from today.
Over at the Pentagon, Jim Miklashevsky on duty for us tonight. Jim, thanks for that. And there is the other Iraq story that continues to make big news around the world tonight, especially the Arab world and beyond. The shaky, grainy video of the Saddam execution, apparently recorded by a cell phone camera. It is, at the very least, a huge PR problem for the Iraqi government and the United States. And tonight, the question: who made this crude recording and who allowed it to happen at such a heavily secured event? Our NBC News Middle East correspondent Richard Engel is in Baghdad tonight.
As protests against Saddam Hussein's execution grow, so do questions about what happened during his final.
NBC Nightly News continues after a break from Washington. This Tuesday evening, NBC News In Depth. Today marks a year since the Sago mine disaster. But are those Americans who work underground every day any safer today as a result? And later, a final remembrance on this National Day of Mourning for President Gerald R. Ford.
Good morning.
NBC. Back now from Washington with NBC News In Depth. A year ago tonight, this nation held a kind of collective vigil watching on television for 13 coal miners trapped deep underground in the Sago mine in West Virginia, you may recall. Only one of those miners ultimately got out. He was barely alive. The rest of them died during what was an especially deadly year for American miners. And consider the stats. While a total of 22 miners died on the job in all of 2005, more than twice that number, 47 of them, including the Sago miners, lost their lives last year. NBC News correspondent Tom Costello reports tonight on what has changed and what hasn't.
In West Virginia today, Randall McCloy, the lone survivor of the Sago mine disaster, joined the family.
And after a break, when NBC Nightly News continues in a moment, a new report card out tonight, 5 years after 9/11. It's about which American cities are and are not prepared in the event of a new disaster.
NBC Nightly News tomorrow.
To New Orleans now, where there was an emotional scene as 7 police officers turned themselves in to face murder charges stemming from a shooting incident on that city's so-called Danziger Bridge in the post-Hurricane Katrina chaos. Dozens of supporters greeted the men as they entered the city jail, shouting down a smaller group of protesters who were chanting slogans about mostly police brutality and racism. 2 men were killed and 4 were wounded in that incident on the bridge. The officers insist for their part they were fired upon and were returning fire. Tonight, we have learned that a new report coming out tomorrow from the Department of Homeland Security here in Washington has a snapshot of which U.S. cities have made the most progress, now 5 years after 9/11, in preparing for the possibility of another disaster like a major terrorist attack on this country. Our Justice correspondent Pete Williams has more from our Washington bureau here tonight. Pete, good evening.
Brian, good evening to you. This new scorecard says that only a handful of U.S. cities have done all they can to prepare for communicating effectively during a disaster, sharing radio frequencies, planning to work with surrounding areas, and figuring out who would be in charge. 4 of the nation's big cities get the top scores: San Diego, Columbus, Ohio, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Washington. And in smaller areas, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Laramie County, Wyoming were tops. Among cities scoring the lowest, the report says that Chicago and surrounding Cook County have 2 separate disaster plans, but not one for working together. And it says Philadelphia would have scored higher, but hasn't trained enough to work with surrounding areas. Cleveland and Baton Rouge also scored low, and New York's communication system was found wanting. The report does not say that these cities are unprepared, just that they have to do better to plan for disaster response, Brian.
This may mean a lot of people moving to Sioux Falls. Pete Williams across town here in our Washington bureau. Pete, thanks for that report. Former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani hasn't officially entered the race for the Republican presidential nomination yet, But already his campaign has apparently made a whopper of a mistake. A 140-page binder containing top-secret plans for just about every aspect of his campaign was sent to the New York Daily News, which published the details this morning. The source said the binder had been left behind in one of the cities Giuliani recently visited. The campaign plan includes bullet points, apparently, listing his personal political vulnerabilities, including his business ties and his 3 marriages. We'll be right back after a moment with a final remembrance as this National Day of Mourning for President Gerald Ford begins to come to an end.
News with Brian Williams, now available as a video podcast. Watch anytime, anywhere, free. Podcasts.msnbc.com. The playoffs are coming.
Back here in Washington tonight, where earlier today inside the massive National Cathedral, the highest spot in the city, 4 men were called upon by the Ford family to remember the man who occupied the highest office in the land. Tonight, we leave you with a sampling of their praise for former President Gerald Ford.
History has a way of matching man and moment. And just as President Lincoln's stubborn devotion to our Constitution kept the Union together during the Civil War, so too can we say that Jerry Ford's decency was the ideal remedy for the deception of Watergate.
Early in his administration, Gerald Ford said to me, "I get mad as hell, but I don't show it when I don't do as well as I should. If you don't strive for the best, you will never make it." Jerry Ford always did his best.
In many ways, I believe football was a metaphor for his life in politics and after. He played in the middle of the line. He was a center, a position that seldom receives much praise, but he had his hands on the ball for every play, and no play could start without him. And when the game was over and others received the credit, he didn't whine or whimper.
Gerald Ford assumed the presidency when the nation needed a leader of character and humility, and we found it in the man from Grand Rapids. President Ford's time in office was brief, but history will long remember the courage and common sense that helped restore trust in the workings of our democracy.
The voices of remembrance earlier today. And so on this Tuesday night, Gerald R. Ford has left Washington for the last time. He left his beloved Capitol Hill behind us here, and tonight he is back home with the people who sent him to Washington and those who know him best. They watch over him now. That is our broadcast for this Tuesday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams reporting tonight from Washington. We'll look for you again tomorrow night back home in New York. Good night.
Next, Jessica Simpson kissing.
Collision course. President Bush prepares to shake up his wartime command, placing 2 top generals on the eve of announcing a new Iraq strategy. But with Democrats now in control of Congress, is the stage being set for a showdown? Wild weather tornadoes sweep through the south, blizzards paralyze the plains, and cherry blossoms bloom in the east. What is going on this winter?